Let me begin with a question that may seem almost too simple. What makes someone a leader? You may answer vision or intelligence or the ability to inspire others. But for the first half of the 20th century, the most prominent answer in academic and professional circles were essentially you are either born with it or you are not. Leadership in the dominant view was a property of extraordinary individuals, not a skill to be developed, not a relationship to be cultivated, and certainly not a phenomenon shaped by the situation at hand. That assumption shaped decades of research, and it was ultimately wrong, or at the very least profoundly incomplete. In this video, I'll discuss the development of leadership theory prior to the 1950s. This is the first video of our historical tour of how leadership research evolved in the rigorous scientific field it is today. Let's begin. To understand why leadership theory developed as it did before 1950, we needed to understand the world in which the scholars were working. The first quarter of the 20th century was defined by industrialization. Large factories and manufacturing enterprises demanded coordination at a scale that had never been attempted before. Someone needed to ensure that hundreds of workers showed up, followed instruction, produced goods efficiently, and did so reliably. The practical question was, who should manage those people and how? The dominant intellectual response came from Frederick Winslow Taylor. His Principle of Scientific Management, published in 1911, argued that the manager's job was to determine exactly what was expected of workers and ensure that those expectations were met with maximum efficiency and minimal waste. Taylor was an industrial engineer by training, and he approached human work as though it were a mechanical problem. Break each task into its smallest components, time it, find the best way, pay workers for output, eliminate variability. From Taylor's viewpoint, workers were interchangeable parts in a system optimized by the management, and managerial authority was the impersonal, technical authority of expertise. This view of organizational direction was enormously influential. It offered a clear answer to the question of who should direct whom. The person with the most precise knowledge of the work, technical competence established through position was sufficient. But the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s disrupted that complacency in dramatic ways. The Great Depression of the 1929 destroyed confidence in the idea that rational, efficient management was enough to sustain organizational life. Labor unrest shook the assumption that workers were simply compliant instruments. The rise of unions gave ordinary employees a collective voice that management had to reckon with, and that meant leaders could no longer simply issue directives. They had to persuade, negotiate, and motivate. Then came the Second World War. Between 1939 to 1945, the United States had to expand its military from a relatively small professional force into one of the largest fighting organizations in human history. Someone had to select officers. Someone had to train commanders. Someone had to figure out what made a military leader effective under enormous pressure and with lives at stake. And this was a national emergency. And alongside all of this, universities were growing. Business schools were being founded. The idea that management could be taught and therefore studied was taking hold. Harvard Business School, founded in 1908, was the most prominent example. Its early curriculum was organized around efficiency and administrative science. By the 1930s, it had begun to shift toward something more behavioral and human. Psychology and sociology were gaining institutional legitimacy as disciplines, and with that came the tools, surveys, experiments, statistical analysis that made a systemic study of leadership possible. The starting point of any history of leadership theory is the great man theory. In this view, history is not made by social forces, economic conditions, or collective action. It's made by extraordinary individuals, generals, statesmen, and industrialists, whose innate qualities set them apart from ordinary people and destine them for leadership. In the American context, this translated into celebration of business tycoons, presidents, and military heroes. The implicit model of leadership was biographical. If you wanted to study leadership, you study great leaders. You read about them. You try to identify what made them exceptional. This approach had an important and frequently overlooked limitation. Notice what it assumed, that great men was indeed men, and that they belonged to a particular social class, and that their greatness was something they had from birth, instead of something they developed through practice or circumstance. Herbert Spencer, the English sociologist, offered an early challenge to this view. As early as 1860, he argued that so-called great men are often products of their social environments instead of autonomous creators of history. In other words, circumstances produce leaders as much as leaders shape circumstances. That tension between the leader as extraordinary individual versus the leader as the product of context would drive much of the theory development that followed. By the early 20th century, the great man theory was losing credibility as a scientific proposition, even if it retained cultural power. Scholars began asking, if great leaders have special qualities, can those qualities be identified, measured, and studied systematically? And that question launched the era of trait theory. Trait theory retained the great man theory assumption, which was leaders are exceptional individuals with distinctive qualities. But trait theory subjected that assumption to empirical scrutiny. If leaders have special traits, those traits should be measurable. If they are measurable, they can be studied. Beginning in the 1920s and accelerating through the 1930s, researchers compiled a list of attributes that they believed distinguished leaders from followers: intelligence, self-confidence, physical stature, moral courage, ambition, energy, sociability. Dozens of studies were conducted on military officers, business managers, and others in leadership roles, but the results were very frustrating. The trait that predicted leadership in one study failed to replicate in another. The profile of the effective leader kept shifting depending on who was studied, what context was investigated, and how traits were measured. By 1948, enough studies had accumulated that Ralph Stogdill undertook what we would now call a systemic review. In his article titled Personal Factors Associated with Leadership, a Survey of the Literature, Stogdill conducted an analysis of 124 studies on the relationship between personal traits and leadership. The conclusions were sobering. No single trait and no combination of traits reliably differentiated leaders from non-leaders across all situations. Leaders were, on average, slightly more intelligent, more extroverted than their followers, but those differences were very modest, inconsistent, and context-dependent. Stogdill's review is in many ways the influential empirical document of this era. It did not quite kill trait theory, but it demonstrates definitely that the simple version of the trait approach was untenable. Stogdill's deeper insight was that leadership is a relational phenomenon. It arises not from the attributes of an individual in isolation, but from the interaction between a person's qualities, the needs of the group, and the demands of the situation. A person may lead effectively in one context and fail entirely in another. This was the intellectual seed from which situational and contingency theories would later grow. Why did the trait theory stumble so badly? There are several reasons. First, the methods of measurement were inconsistent. Different researchers measure intelligence or confidence or dominance in very different ways. It made comparisons across studies nearly impossible. Second, the theoretical logic was weak. Trait theory could identify correlations, but it could not explain why a particular trait would produce effective leadership, or when it would matter and when it would not. Third, the samples were deeply limited. Most trait studies examined people already in leadership positions, often low-level managers, without examining how those people came to be in those positions in the first place. This approach risks tautology, which is a statement that is always true by its logical structure. Here, the assumption was that people in charge must have leadership traits, rather than that leadership traits explain how they came to be in charge. And fourth, trait theory was shaped by the same social biases as the great man theory it was supposed to replace. The research samples were overwhelmingly male, predominantly white, and largely drawn from military and corporate hierarchies. The implicit model of a leader was a man of authority and social privilege. The possibility that leadership qualities may manifest differently across gender, culture, or social position was not even framed as a question worth asking. Despite its limitations, trait theory made a lasting contribution. It established that leadership was a legitimate subject of empirical study. It produced a body of research that subsequent scholars could critique, synthesize, and build on, although that body of research was flawed and inconsistent. Modern leadership research on traits, for example, on emotional intelligence, on the Big Five personality dimensions, on charisma, is basically a continuation of the old trait theory approach. The main difference is that it now uses much better research methods and pay far more attention to the situation and context. As confidence in the pure trait approach waned, scholars began turning their attention from who leaders are to what leaders do. This shift from traits to behaviors carried a different set of assumptions and had a different set of practical implications. If leadership effectiveness depends on behaviors instead of innate traits, then in principle, leadership can be taught. That conclusion has enormous stakes for organizations, for militaries, and for educational institutions. The most influential early behavioral research in this period was conducted by Kurt Lewin and his colleagues. In 1939, they ran a series of experiments in which groups of school children were assigned to leaders who displayed one of three styles: authoritarian, democratic, or laissez-faire. The authoritarian leaders made all decisions unilaterally and directed the children with strong control. The democratic leaders engaged children in decision-making and encouraged participation. The laissez-faire leaders provided minimal direction and essentially left the children to manage themselves. The findings were striking. Authoritarian leadership produced high output in the short term. It also produced aggression, dependency, and a hostile social climate. Democratic leadership produced slightly lower output, but considerably more positive group morale and genuine cooperation. Laissez-faire leadership produced neither productivity nor satisfaction. It simply generated frustration and drift. This experiment was groundbreaking for several reasons. It demonstrated empirically and under controlled conditions that leadership style has measurable effects on group outcomes. A leadership style is a pattern of how a leader behaves. Here, Lewin's studies suggested that democratic leadership, at least under the three conditions, produce the most sustainable and satisfying outcomes. Around the same time, a different kind of evidence was accumulating from an industrial setting. The Hawthorne studies had begun as an investigation into physical working conditions and productivity. The studies got their name because they were conducted at the Western Electric Company's Hawthorne Works factory between 1924 and 1932. The Hawthorne studies began as an investigation into how physical working conditions such as lighting, break schedules, and work hours influenced productivity. But the results were deeply puzzling. Productivity tended to increase regardless of what changes were made. After extensive analysis, researchers concluded that the key variable was not the physical conditions, but the social environment, the fact that workers felt observed, included, and cared about. What mattered most was that the workers had formed a team with strong social bonds and supportive supervision. Their cohesion, not the lighting or the break schedule, was the driver of sustained performance. The broader takeaway was that effective leadership requires attention to the social and emotional needs of workers. A leader who listens, who shows personal interest in subordinates, who builds team cohesion, who communicates in ways that make people feel valued is a more effective leader than the one who simply issues directives and monitors compliance. This was a direct challenge to Taylorism. Taylor had assumed that workers are primarily motivated by monetary reward and respond to clear directions and strong supervision. The Hawthorne studies suggested that social belonging, recognition, and the quality of supervisory relationships are at least as important. By the late 1940s, this insight was finding institutional support. Harvard Business School, which had initially been deeply influenced by Taylorist principles, was by the mid-1930s incorporated behavioral science into its curriculum. This institutional embrace of behavioral perspectives meant that future managers were being trained not just to optimize tasks, but also to understand and influence human behavior in organizations. It's worth noting that the behavioral research of the late 1940s was still in an early formative state. Lewin's experiment was a single demonstration, not a cumulative body of evidence. The Hawthorne interpretation was contested, and subsequent analysis suggests that the conclusion was overstated. Nevertheless, the momentum was clear. By 1950, leadership was increasingly understood as someone does in interaction with followers, not just someone is. Although the trait and behavioral researchers were working through their own research questions, a small number of broader, more integrative thinkers were offering insights that will only be fully appreciated decades later. Two deserve particular attention. Mary Parker Follett, who lived from 1968 to 1933, was a social worker, consultant, and intellect whose ideas about leadership and organizations prefigured many concepts that the field would not formally articulate until the 1970s and 1980s. Follett's central contribution was a fundamental reconceptualization of power. She distinguished between what she called power over, the coercive exercise of authority over subordinates, and power with, the collaborative generation of power through joint efforts. In Follett's view, leadership consists of enabling others to exercise their own capabilities. Follett stated in 1924, over 100 years ago, the most essential work of the leader is to create more leaders. Follett also articulated what she called the law of the situation. Instead of following the commands of a hierarchical superior, she argued leaders and followers should together determine what the situation demands and act accordingly. This is, in early form, a contingency argument. Effective leadership is not the application of a fixed authority structure, but a contextually appropriate response to specific circumstances. Follett advocated for what she called integration as the preferred approach to conflict, to find creative solutions that satisfy all parties instead of forcing one party's preferences on another. This is recognizable from a contemporary vantage point as a precursor to both participative decision-making theory and principled negotiation. Follett did not receive widespread recognition during her lifetime. The barriers were multiple. She was a woman in a field dominated by men. Her ideas were more philosophically sophisticated than the empirical culture of her time could easily accommodate. And her work was centered on collaboration and ethics in a context that privileged efficiency and control. But retrospectively, scholars have credited her as a foundational figure, a prophet of management, whose insights laid the foundation for servant leadership, shared leadership, and transformational leadership theory. Chester Barnard occupies a different position in this intellectual landscape. He was not an academic, but a practicing executive. He was the president of New Jersey Bell Telephone. He wrote The Functions of the Executive in 1938. It was a book that became one of the most influential management texts of the 20th century. Barnard's argument was that organizations are fundamentally cooperative systems. People choose to participate in organizations, and that participation is voluntary in a deeper sense than formal employment contracts suggest. According to Barnard, the executive's role is to ensure the conditions under which individuals are willing to cooperate toward a shared goal. It means the executive is expected to maintain a delicate balance between organizational needs and individual motivation. Barnard's most provocative theoretical contribution was the acceptance theory of authority. Barnard argued that authority does not flow automatically from position or rank. It depends on whether subordinates accept the orders they receive. A command that is not accepted is not effective authority, regardless of the formal status of the person who issued it. This turns the classical view of organizational authority on its head. It prefigures decades of research on legitimacy, influence, and follower-centric perspectives on leadership. Barnard also injected moral seriousness into his analysis. He believed organizations endure in proportion to the equality of the moral framework that governs them. A leader of low moral character may maintain control for a period, but such leadership is inherently unstable. Effective leadership requires ethical integrity, not just technical competence. This idea laid the foundation for the later literature on authentic leadership and ethical leadership that emerged decades later. Together, Follett and Barnard represent a strand of thinking that transcended the trait versus behavior dichotomy entirely. They were asking a different and in many ways deeper set of questions. What is the moral basis of leadership? What is the relationship between authority and consent? How do leaders create conditions for human cooperation instead of mere compliance? Those questions would eventually become central to the leadership research, but they had to wait for the field to mature enough to receive them. No account of the pre-1950 leadership theory would be complete without acknowledging the influence of German sociologist Max Weber, whose ideas centered American organizational scholarship through English translations in the 1940s. Weber proposed a typology of authority that offered a sociological insight for understanding different types of leadership. He distinguished the three types: traditional authority, which is grounded in long-established customs and inherited positions; legal rational authority, which is grounded in formally established rules and in personal procedures; and charismatic authority, grounded in followers' belief in the exceptional personal qualities of a specific individual. For American organizational scholars, the most immediately relevant of the three types was legal rational authority, the kind that governs bureaucratic organizations like government agencies, corporations, and military hierarchies. Weber's analysis of bureaucracy explained how large, complex organizations could function with consistency and predictability by replacing personal discretion with formal rules and clearly defined roles. But the concept that most captured the imagination of leadership theorists was charisma. In Weber's formulation, the charismatic leaders has, or is perceived to have, supernatural, superhuman, or at least specifically exceptional powers or qualities. Importantly, Weber located charismatic authority in the relationship between leaders and followers. It is the followers' recognition of the leader's exceptional qualities that gives the leader charismatic authority, not the quality themselves. Charismatic leadership tends to arise in times of crisis, when established routines and formal structures fail to provide adequate guidance and people seek someone with vision and extraordinary capacity. This sociological account of charisma was, in one sense, a more sophisticated version of great man theory. It acknowledged the role of exceptional individual quality, but is different from great man theory. It was relational and contextual. Charisma is not simply present in an individual. It is produced through a social relationship. It tends to emerge under specific historical conditions. That insight pointed toward contingency thinking and toward the later theory development of transformational leadership theory, which would explicitly build on Weber's concept of charisma. The year 1947 was a pivotal one in the history of administrative science. That was the year Herbert Simon published Administrative Behavior, a study of decision-making processes in administrative organizations. Simon's argument was foundational. He proposed that decision-making is the heart of administration. To understand leadership in organizations, you must understand how decisions are made and that the vocabulary of administrative theory must be derived from the logic and the psychology of human choice. The book's most influential concept was bounded rationality. Simon argued that human decision-makers do not maximize utility in the measure that classical economic theory assumed. They cannot have all available information. They cannot evaluate all possible alternatives. They cannot make perfect rational choices. Instead, they operate within cognitive and emotional constraints. They choose the first option that meets a threshold of acceptability instead of optimize. This was a fundamental challenge to the assumptions that underlay not only Taylorism, but much of the classical organizational theory of the era. Simon's work was immediately recognized as influential. His book went through multiple editions. We'll read that book in the administrative decision-making class. Simon himself received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1978. His research was very interdisciplinary, spanning cognitive science, computer science, public administration, management, and political science. For leadership theory specifically, Simon's contribution was to shift attention from what leaders should do in an idealized, fully rationalized world to what leaders actually do in a world of limited information, limited time, and limited cognitive capacity. Leaders are not omniscient optimizers. They are decision makers operating under conditions of uncertainty, with imperfect information and bounded cognitive resources. Understanding leadership requires understanding those conditions. Where Taylor had designed management system to minimize the need for judgment by workers, Simon argued that judgment and all its attendant limitations is inescapable. Where Barnard had emphasized the moral and social dimensions of organizational life, Simon added cognitive realism. Together, the three perspectives, Taylor's rationalized efficiency, Barnard's cooperative morality, and Simon's bounded rationality, captured the intellectual terrain of administrative science as it stood on the eve of the 1950s. Let me bring the theory development back to the specific domain of educational leadership. Let me first clarify terminology. The terminological history of the field reflects its uncertainty about its own identity. In the early years, educational administration was the dominant term. By the 1970s, educational management became more common, particularly in the United Kingdom and Europe. And at the end of the 20th century, educational leadership displaced both as the standard designation. The shifts in terminology reflect changing assumptions about what the field is fundamentally about. Administration implies technical coordination. Management implies control over resources. Leadership implies the exercise of influence toward shared goals. Now, in the specific subfield of educational leadership, a parallel but distinct story was unfolding. The field of educational administration, we now call educational leadership, traces its origins to the early 1900s in the United States. The first book on the subject was written by Harold Payne in 1875. Prior to 1950, universities hired professors to teach aspiring school administrators, and most of those professors were retired school principals and superintendents from large urban school districts. Their teaching drew on practices, the cautious recommendation of promising techniques, personal success stories, and lively anecdotes, all surrounded with the aura of common sense. And that was the state of the field. The oldest journal in educational leadership is NASSP Bulletin, the Journal of the National Association of Secondary School Principals, whose first volume appeared in 1917. And it was in that journal in 1941 that maybe the first published article on instructional leadership appeared. Harold Spears, a director of research and secondary education in Indiana, argued in that article that instructional leadership should not be limited to administrative tasks like authority delegation. It should focus on the development of children. This was a small but significant signal. Someone in educational administration was beginning to think about the substance of leadership, not just the mechanics of administration. Then in 1947, the National Council of Professors of Educational Administration, the NCPEA, was founded. That same year, the Cold War began. The word computer was first used in reference to an electronic digital machine, and in the broader field of organizational and leadership research. The year 1947 was also when Herbert Simon published his seminal work, Administrative Behavior, a Study of Decision-Making Processes in Administrative Organizations. And here is the key point. Although the broader field of leadership research was producing theories and empirical studies, educational administration had none of that. The theoretical foundation of educational administration simply did not exist. It would not begin to develop until the 1950s, when a new generation of scholars deliberately set out to establish it on scientific grounds. That transition is the subject of our next video. But to understand it, we needed to understand what was happening in the broader field of leadership research before the 1950s, because it was from that broader field that educational leadership scholars drew their intellectual tools.